Get informed, get inspired, and get connected. CannabisRadio.com presents NCIA's Cannabis Industry Voice. The National Cannabis Industry Association is the only national trade organization representing the businesses of the legal cannabis industry. NCIA's Cannabis Industry Voice covers a range of topics, including the rapidly evolving political and policy changes that affect our industry, news and events of importance to cannabis professionals, and features on companies, individuals, and campaigns at the cutting edge of the cannabis industry. NCIA's Cannabis Industry Voice begins now.
My friends, I am Vivian McPeak, and this is Hempresent. If you have feedback or would like to suggest a guest or topic for Hempresent, email me at hempresent@gmail.com. I greatly enjoy hearing from you, the listener. Today's guest on Hempresent is Sam Darkangelo. Since 2018, Sam's been the director for HeadCount's Cannabis Voter Project initiative that aims to get people to the polls by educating them about the ways their vote can influence cannabis policy. Prior to working with HeadCount, Sam was a writer and online editor for Relix magazine and OffBeat magazine, and a staff writer for the Marijuana Policy Project. He interned with HeadCount during his senior year at the New School, where he received his BA in history, and in 2012, Sam received his Master of Public Affairs from the University of Texas at Austin in 2020. A native of New Orleans, Sam is a fan of funk music, Mardi Gras, and Saints football, and I'm a fan of his really important work. Welcome, Sam, to Cannabis Radio.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really excited.
Awesome. So HeadCount is a nonpartisan organization that uses the power of music to register voters and promote participation in democracy. What more can you tell us about your organization?
Yeah, so HeadCount, as you mentioned, is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that works really in the music community to get fans of live music excited about voting and registered to vote, just overall participating in the democratic process. What we've been known for since we launched in 2004 is registering people to vote at concerts and music festivals. We like to meet young people where they're at, and music festivals, concerts, great places to meet large gatherings of young people. So, if you've ever seen people registering voters at concerts and music festivals, very good chance it's been us, whether it's at Bonnaroo or at, concerts for artists like Ariana Grande, Beyonce, Harry Styles, really those massive pop stars, but also, we have our roots in the jam band scene as well, coming out of, the Grateful Dead affiliated universe, bands like Fish, Dead and Company, Dave Matthews Band. We've been at those shows for a very long time. As well. In fact, Bob Weir is actually on our board of directors of the Grateful Dead. But a couple of years ago, after so many years of really targeting the live music community and the music community and doing that in such a big way, we decided to focus also with a new campaign, the Cannabis Voter Project, that would target the cannabis community in much the same way that we've targeted the live music community over the years. And really the impetus behind that was recognizing that whenever we saw cannabis legalization initiatives on the ballot in certain states, we would see really big bumps in the enthusiasm from the young folks that we would, encounter in those states about voting. People, why are you registering to vote this year? Well, cannabis. Got to vote for cannabis legalization. Cannabis is on the ballot. And so we realized that cannabis, and there's some data that bears this out too. When you have those legalization initiatives, there are bumps in youth voter turnout. But I like to say that we've recognized cannabis as a gateway issue that can get young people excited about participating in the political process, and that's in large part what this campaign aims to do.
Yeah, in the 2016 election, cannabis polled better than all the candidates individually or collectively. I was a founder of Seattle Hemp Fest back in 1991. Back then, we heard from many naysayers that we were wasting our time, that prohibition was here to stay. And many people laughed at us. And some of those people who were laughing before are coughing today because they're smoking legal weed, right? When people tell me their vote doesn't matter, I remind them that weed didn't legalize itself in these states. What are your thoughts on the way that voting has moved cannabis policy forward so far?
Well, I think you really nailed it right there. Weed didn't legalize itself in Washington or Colorado or Massachusetts or California, et cetera. It's only recently that you're starting to see, the legislative process used as a tool to legalize cannabis in certain states. And even that, there's a large voting component as well. But, I think you really hit the nail on the head there. One of the things that we run into a lot in this line of work of registering particularly young people to vote is this kind of apathy, right? A lot of people who want to just sink into this, voting doesn't matter, who cares, it's all the same, blah, 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 blah. But when you look at an issue like cannabis, and as you said, in Washington, Colorado, people went and they voted and they saw a material improvement in their lives as a result of voting. They saw an actual, discrete policy change happen because they went to the polls and in a way that improved their lives and improved their friends' lives, families' lives. And it's just very easy to show the one-to-one of, well, you're going to tell me voting doesn't matter. You like cannabis. Well, look at all of these states that have legalized cannabis. Look at the attention that cannabis is now getting on the national level in Congress as a result, in many ways, of seeing, blue states, red states, purple states all vote in favor of big cannabis reforms in 2020. So, there's a whole lot of ways that cannabis policy has been moved forward by voting. But I mean, you named the big one. States have legalized, whether it's been, adult use or medical or various other policy changes. They've come in large part directly from voting at the ballot box.
Yeah, and of course, it's so funny. People say, I'm not going to vote because my vote doesn't matter. It's like, yeah, your vote doesn't matter if you don't cast it, right? That's the vote that doesn't matter, right? We happen to be having this conversation on the 9th anniversary of Washington State becoming the first U.S. state to legalize recreational use of marijuana and the first to allow recreational marijuana sales. Of course, Colorado was around the same time. But cannabis is still federally illegal. There are tens of thousands of Americans in jails and prisons over the plant today. How important is our vote moving forward in terms of ending prohibition for good?
Well, look, you're never going to get like a national referendum here. And in some ways, it's not even the votes themselves that are as important as making known where you as a voter stand on this issue. We recently launched, a campaign a couple weeks ago called Cannabis in Common. You can check it out, cannabisincommon.org. We had, supported videos from Seth Rogen, Sarah Silverman, a whole lot of different cannabis companies got behind it. The idea really being, the American people disagree on a whole lot of things, but we have cannabis in common. We largely, more than 2/3 of us agree that cannabis should be legalized, want to see cannabis policy move forward, but there's been, a surprising lack of movement, or maybe not that surprising, depending on how you look at it, from Congress. And so, it's not just about, well, yeah, it is in a lot of ways. You got to go out and vote. You got to make it known that you are a voter. But you also want to let the people that you're voting for, the people who represent you, know where you stand on this issue, and let them know not that this is just where you stand, but that it's actually an important issue to you. I think a lot of times with cannabis, it's not just, people might see that there's, large levels of support, but there's this question in the minds of politicians, well, how important is this issue to the individual voter? Do I really need to expend my political capital dealing with it? And if enough people make noise, you can convince them otherwise. And that's, the idea behind Cannabis in Common there.
Sam, HeadCount has conducted voter registration drives at more than 1,000 live events each year since 2004. You've signed up over 1 million voters through your work with, like you said, touring musicians like Ariana Grande, Dead & Company, Beyonce, etc. I imagine the pandemic has created many challenges for you with the temporary near total shutdown of live music. What has that experience been like, and how has HeadCount responded?
Well, it did create a lot of challenges, and live events will always be, HeadCount's bread and butter in a lot of ways. But HeadCount actually posted, and this is not Cannabis Voter Project per se, although we had a great year as well. But HeadCount, as the organization, actually had its best year ever in 2020 in terms of number of people registered to vote, and that was in large part due, the pandemic. It put us in a corner, but it also forced us to really lean hard into the digital activism, into finding new ways to kind of maximize our footprint in the digital space. And that turned out to be incredibly effective. And a lot of great work was done there. So there was definitely some challenges, but I think HeadCount as an organization met them. And like I said, ended up having by far its best year ever in 2020, despite the various challenges with the pandemic. That said, as concerts and music festivals start to open up in a much bigger way, we're very excited to be getting back out on the road there, registering people, in person, because, as great as it is to register people online, that's extremely important. There's really something about that face-to-face conversation, a young person speaking with another young person, explaining to them, look, this is why this matters, getting them registered to vote. And I think it leaves, a pretty important impression. So we're stoked to be getting back out in the field, but I think we really, we thrived in a lot of ways in the digital space.
Wow, that's great news. I'm talking to Sam D'Arcangelo from HeadCount. We're going to take a quick break, come back with our second segment. Don't go anywhere.
NCIA's Cannabis Industry Voice will return once we give a voice to our sponsors.
We are back with Sam D'Arcangelo from HeadCount. Sam, HeadCount utilizes community volunteers, and I read that you have more than 40,000 volunteers nationwide, organized into local street teams in almost every major U.S. city. It's just vitally important that everybody participate in democracy. Can people get involved and join a HeadCount street team in their city? How do people support your organization?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really glad that you asked this, because I always love to plug this aspect of what HeadCount does. You can go to headcount.org right now if you're interested and sign up to volunteer at one of any shows, festivals in your area. You can also go to cannabisvoter.info. That's the website for the Cannabis Voter Project specifically. We have a volunteer sign up page there that you can go check out if you want to do stuff with the Cannabis Voter Project. But HeadCount, like you said, 1,000+ events every year. And really it's a lot of fun. Participating in democracy is incredibly important. But the way that HeadCount does it, you volunteer at a concert, maybe a music festival. Most of the time you get to stick around and see the show. So great way to meet like-minded people. Great way to just connect with a lot of folks in your community, fans of similar bands as you. And highly recommend checking out headcount.org and volunteering. It's a lot of fun.
Great. For years, legalization was somewhat a partisan issue. Not that all Democrats supported it, but Republicans were traditionally strongly opposed. But right now, Republican Nancy Mace and 5 Republican co-sponsors have recently introduced the States Reform Act, which would federally legalize cannabis by removing it from the federal schedule. And Democrat Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has teamed up with Republican Representative Dave Joyce to advance the HOPE Act to expunge records of Americans who've had nonviolent cannabis arrests. Do you think that things are changing, and how hopeful are you that we might actually see federal legalization sooner rather than later?
Yeah, I do. I think things are definitely changing. I think, you really spoke to that with regards to the partisanness of the issue. One thing that's always been true about cannabis and it remains true today is that politicians are well behind, the people on this issue.
Yeah.
And so I think that cannabis is certainly becoming less partisan at the politician level. You look at the MORE Act vote, for instance, just a year ago, and it was overwhelmingly Democrats voting in favor, and then a handful of Republicans also signing on. But then now you've got a few more Republicans who've come together around this Mace bill, as you just described. But when you look at the voters, you see some polls showing as much as 51% slight majority support among Republican voters for cannabis legalization. And you see nowhere near that level of support from, say, Republican politicians. And on the Democratic side, especially in the Senate, you see polls showing 70, 80% support for legalization among Democrats. You don't see 70, 80% support in the Senate for federal, descheduling, at least not publicly. And so this issue is incredibly nonpartisan when you get down to the voters, and it's increasingly nonpartisan. Every passing year, the numbers go up a little bit, and that goes across partisan lines. Republicans, Independents, Democrats, and we talked about this earlier. But if you look at the states that voted for cannabis legalization in 2020, you had New Jersey, basically a blue state; Arizona, a kind of purple swing state; Montana, South Dakota. Those are traditionally red states, as we'd say, voting in favor of legalization. So you've got majority support in any state, regardless of where the politics are at this point, is what it looks like. Now, what does that mean for federal legalization going forward? I think that what we have right now is the most cannabis-friendly Senate that has ever existed.
We're going to take another break and come back with our final segment with Sam D'Arcangelo.
NCIA's Cannabis Industry Voice will return once we give a voice to our sponsors.
And we're back talking about HeadCount. Sam, for years, legalization was a somewhat partisan issue as Republicans were traditionally strongly opposed. Not that all Democrats were supportive, but Republican Nancy Mace and 5 Republican co-sponsors just recently introduced the States Reform Act, which would federally legalize cannabis by removing it from the federal schedule. And Democrat Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has teamed up with Republican Representative Dave Joyce to advance the HOPE Act, which would expunge records of Americans who've had nonviolent cannabis arrests. Do you think that things are changing? And how hopeful are you that we might be seeing federal legalization sooner rather than later?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. I'm really glad that you brought up the partisan aspect of cannabis reform, or rather the nonpartisan aspect. One of the things that we focus on with Cannabis in Common is this idea that cannabis is a truly nonpartisan issue. But in some respects, that's actually much more true of the voters than it is of the politicians, right? And that's just kind of a running theme here in cannabis policy in general, this idea that the voters have been well ahead of the politicians on this issue. But, if we're going to talk about what's going on in Congress, you have the Mace bill there with, as you mentioned, 5 Republican co-sponsors. There were maybe about 5 or 6 Republicans who voted in favor of the MORE Act, which was the first, big descheduling bill to pass any chamber of Congress back about a year ago. But largely, the votes in Congress have been from Democrats. These have been Democrat shepherded bills. You had, the vast majority of Democrats vote for the MORE Act, while only a handful or so of Republicans voted in favor of it. And then that's kind of odd, really, when you look at the polls that show a lot of them now, about 51% small majorities of, or even Republican voters are in favor of cannabis legalization now. And you don't see anywhere near 51% of Republican politicians getting behind this issue. But that's also true on the Democratic side as well. If you look at the Senate, polls show somewhere 70 to 80% or so of Democrats are in favor of legalizing cannabis, and yet you don't see that level of support from senators, at least not publicly, in the Senate for cannabis legalization. And the Senate really is what matters here, right? Like I brought up the MORE Act that passed the House a year ago. You've got the Mace bill moving forward in the House, which it seems like an interesting sort of compromise bill aimed at appeasing sort of both sides of the aisle, kind of trying to present itself as something of a nonpartisan cannabis legalization bill. But the Senate's really where the holdup's going to be, and that's where you have to really look if you're wondering where things are going to go in the next year. I mean, right now, the way that things are with the filibuster, needing 60 votes, it's pretty hard to imagine that you're going to get a full descheduling bill over the finish line, in the next year in the current Congress. That being said, this is, objectively speaking, the most cannabis-friendly Senate that has ever existed, right? Like you can look at the positions people have taken. You can see that right now, we're looking at the most cannabis-friendly Senate ever. The problem is that's a bit of a low bar. The Senate, Congress in general, not historically very open to cannabis legalization. So when you say it's the most cannabis-friendly Senate, it's like, well, compared to what? Compared to past, even less cannabis-friendly Senates. Right now you've got all these debates around the SAFE Act, safe banking, and it's not even clear that that's going to be able to get through in the Senate these days. So, that being said, there's no telling what the Senate's going to look like in 2 years or a year after the midterms pass. This could be the best opportunity for some time to get this stuff over the finish line. And so I really hope that, people view it that way and try to make the most of this opportunity that we have right now. But as to whether or not it will happen, I mean, you have to look how things start to shake out in the Senate next year once we get past all of this reconciliation, infrastructure type stuff that's really been, the main focus in Congress for the last few months now. But once we're over that hill and we seem to be close to it, you're going to see all these other issues that have been on the back burner start to come to the fore. And I certainly hope that cannabis is one of them. And that's why I'd like, for as many folks as possible to head to cannabisincommon.org or, wherever you do these things, give them a call, look them up online, wherever, and just let your elected officials know that this is an important issue to you, that you're a voter and this matters and you want to see this issue move forward.
Sam, you mentioned the midterms, and many of us believe that the Republican Party is engaged in a coordinated attack on our systems of democracy at the moment, spurred on by former President Trump's false accusations that the 2016 national election was rigged. I realize that HeadCount is nonpartisan, but how important is it to you that we defend voting integrity in America right now with the critical midterms approaching next year? I would assume this is a super important issue for HeadCount.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably the most important issue for HeadCount and should be for most Americans, I think. Obviously we've chosen to focus on cannabis with the Cannabis Voter Project and the Cannabis in Common campaign. But the other issue that we've sort of laser focused on at HeadCount, really to an even bigger degree than cannabis, is voting rights. And we actually launched a campaign this past summer called Save the Vote. You can go to headcount.org/save the vote. Just go to headcount.org and click on any of the Save the Vote icons there, and they'll take you to a really great resource that we put together that makes it easy to reach out to your elected officials about voting rights and ask them what they're doing, particularly at the federal level, to ensure that voting rights are protected. In just about every state, there is some sort of, elected, very coordinated push to roll back voting rights. This is happening in pretty much every state. In some states, they've been rather successful. And in other states, they've got the potential to be successful. And really the only thing that can stop it other than, sort of state level organizing is comprehensive voting rights legislation from the federal government. So, it's really crucial at this point, really more than ever, as I said, now that we're getting past reconciliation and, all of these different, the infrastructure bill, all of that, lots of other issues are going to start coming to the fore, and voting rights, you're going to hear it talked about a lot. And that's because it is, the most important thing, not just in this election, but in every election. It's fundamental to what, our country is and how it operates. So please go to Save the Vote, find out what's going on in your state, what legislation's out there trying to limit voting rights where you live, find out where your state compares to other states, but really crucially, make some noise on this issue, go and be heard about this, and let your legislators know that this issue, voting rights, is one of the most important ones for you, because that's the only way we're going to get these people to pass something that protects voting rights, which, you asked if it's important. I mean, it is the most important issue. Not just for what, HeadCount does, but for how American democracy, functions at all. So please, I implore everyone, if you do anything after listening to this, it's go and get educated on what's happening with voting rights where you live and take some action to try and preserve it.
Right on, man. Sam D'Arcangelo from HeadCount, thank you so much for your important work, and thanks for being on Hempresent, bro.
Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. That concludes this installment of the show. When it comes to prohibition, you have the right not to remain silent. Activism requires a voice. Find your voice and speak up for justice, because resistance is fertile. See you next week. Stay strong.
The opinions expressed on this CannabisRadio.com program are those of the guests and hosts and do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of CannabisRadio.com. Any rebroadcast, republication, or retransmission of this program without proper consent is prohibited.